So I want to start out, I want to show, first of all, how we start with get a bulb length from the log, because we've got log resources now. So we've got the log, we've got the pith. Some people think, a slice of that is the bulb, which we know isn't the case. When you have a log and you want to start making bulb lengths out of it, first thing we want to do is usually we want to get rid of the pith. So we usually make a cut here and a cut here with the chainsaw. Right, so we got our log that's however long we want it to be. Make a cut here and a cut here. So when that's our bulb length right there. So our bowl is going to be centered in the side. The pith we take out because it's going to split. If you're going to turn it today and you've got the wood today, you can cut in the center, keep the pith in, and you can turn that out. But if you're going to cut it up and seal it, which is what I do, I'll cut it up, I'll seal it, I'll put anchor seal on both sides on the end grain so it doesn't split, or at least limits the splitting. If we're going to turn it today, you can cut down the middle and turn the pith away today. But that's where we start, is getting our bulb length. And then what I do next is I take the bulb length and I turn it down at the bandsaw, and I'll use something like this, a template just to get it round. So it depends on how big my bulb length is. I've got this that's bottom of a plastic container that I can at least see through, and I've got drawn 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, up to 12 inches diameter, so I can put that pretty much on any of them and make that diameter circle. So that's kind of handy and free. You can buy them. But what I do then is I put this on the bulb length, what size I need. That's too big. And that'll be my template, so when I turn the bandsaw, then I got to have a roughly round piece. That way you can put the chunk on there, but it's a lot easier if you start with something that's fairly round. Doesn't fight you as much on the bandsaw, or sorry, on the lathe. And when I put the template on there, I've got that center hole. I usually tack a nail in a little bit to hold it in place as I'm shaping it on the bandsaw. So I've got a center hole on that side marked. What I'll do is I'll turn the piece over and I'll take that same template and then I'll mark a center hole on the other side. So I have at least the center, rough center of the bulb length on both sides, so it helps me then get it on the lathe. So that's where we are now. We've got this round, sort of round bulb length, and I'm going to mount that on the lathe. You can do that several different ways. You could do that with a screw chuck, and I don't use those a lot, but a lot of people do. There's different kinds of screw chucks. One is this one. It's just made as a designated screw chuck. The other one is with most of the chucks, we end up getting some kind of a screw that goes with that, and this is just one of them that come with the thing with my chuck. So you could drill a hole, screw that in, and then chuck it up. And that's a safe way of doing it.
Eric, on that dedicated, how does that affect the blade?
It's it's threaded, so it just fits right on the spindle. And what I usually do is I'll use some kind of a spur drive. This is a four-pronged spur drive, or two-pronged spur drive. And I'll usually start between centers. So I'll just hammer this into the center to mount on the lathe, bring up the tailstock, and then I can adjust the wood. And I'll show you why I like it that way. So I've got some walnut that's semi-wet, and I want to decide which way do I want to turn this, and I want to have this as the top. So I'm just going to tap that.
Eric, what I've found with spur drives is I've got the 4 and the 2, and a lot of times if you use the 4, if it's a little rough, it'll start spinning. I like the 2 a lot better.
Yeah.
And I'll align them line with the grain so I can get it in there a bit.
Right.
And it makes it so you don't have so much trouble.
Right, doesn't spin as much.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can still drill a hole pretty good with this one.
Uh-huh.
But and with the two even, I just drilled a hole. But you're right, with the particularly with bigger blanks, the two-prong spur drive, you should drive down in there farther, it's going to be less likely to torque and turn that. I'm going to have to get used to a big lathe, aren't I? Yeah. Eventually. All right, so I'm going to bring that up into the center.
Do you lock the tailstock piece there?
Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I don't think you have to, because sometimes you'll adjust it as you're turning. It'll start, if the wood's really wet, particularly, these are going to, the centers are going to try to squeeze that wood. So I just tighten it up as I go. All right, the other thing is safety. You want to make sure you're turning it a little bit to make sure you're not hitting anything. Not hitting the tool rest, anything. And then you want to, I'm going to start pretty much center. So my bowl gouge is going to be about center line, and I'm going to start with some pull cuts. You got to realize the grain of the wood's going this way, right? The tree is this way. So the grain is going that way, and I want to try to cut, I don't want to cut against the grain. I want to cut with the grain. So I'm going to start cutting on this side, and I'm going to look at the other thing I want to look at now is to start getting it lined up as far as the grain pattern. I want the grain pattern to be fairly symmetrical, or do I not care? That's one of the other benefits of starting between centers. If I don't like the orientation, I can back off a little, I can adjust the wood, and I can tighten it back up again and get the angle of the wood right. If you use a face plate, which is the other option, screw a face plate on, you can't really adjust the orientation of the wood. So there's benefits to kind of each way you want to do it. It's just a matter of how you do it and what you're comfortable with.
Starting between centers?
Say it again?
What does that mean?
I'm sorry?
What does starting between centers mean?
Oh, between centers is these two centers.
Oh, gotcha.
So
Rather than on the-
I've just got 2 points holding the wood as opposed to another way to chuck it or hold it on. There we go. All right, so I'm going to speed this up to, if I start getting a little bit of bounce, then I'll stop. This thing doesn't bounce. I've got a lot of bark I've got to get rid of. So what I'm really kind of doing right now is just sort of getting it a little bit rounded and getting rid of, in this piece, the bark. And you want to make sure, always make sure you don't have splits. You know what chunks are going to come off like that bark. And I'm staying out of the line so when it shoots off, it doesn't hit me. what we're also gonna see, this has got a knot in it, which is gonna be really cool. But we'll be able to hear that knot. We've got a little bar cleft.
At least.
What's that?
I said everybody's shavings come off like that.
Oh, absolutely. That's what I love about wet wood.
Or a dog tool. Or a dog tool, or a dog tool, but,
All right, so I've got the bark off, so I'm kind
Get
of
more
close to it.
sawdust.
yeah.
And what I mean by, what I'm trying to do is cut with the grain in this direction because the grain's coming this way. Picture this is a bunch of straws going this way. And I want to cut in this direction. If I cut in this direction, I'm cutting the ends of the straws off. So I'm cutting against the grain. Now you can do that, it's just going to fight you a little more and you'll get more tear out. If I come this way, what I'm doing then is cutting those fibers, so I get a lot smoother cut, for one, and I get awesome shavings, which is probably my favorite thing, rather than getting a lot of sawdust when you're kind of going through against that grain. So that's why I'm kind of trying to stay in this orientation. And then I'm going to look and see I'm pretty symmetrical. I'm pretty symmetrical, so I really don't have to adjust too much. So I'm going to go now back to this base and smooth it out. If I had smoothed this base out before, I really can't adjust it very much. Now that I know I'm not going to really have to adjust the centers, either the tailstock or headstock center, now I can go and smooth off the base, and I can work on preparing my tenon so then I can flip it around. So I'm going to work on this base just a little bit. I'm going to use some pull cuts in this direction, and you bounce a little bit less, but it's still got a little bounce because it's still irregular there.
Eric, when you're roughing out a bowl that you're going to make, and you're looking at the grain of it, how do you, in roughing it out, do you leave it heavy enough so if you want to change the contour, say an OG or rounded, how do you deal with that in the roughing stage?
I need to have some idea of what the final shape needs to be before I finish the roughing. Okay, if I think I want to do a flatter bowl or an OG, I'm going to do a rough OG now.
Yeah, I
Okay.
I don't know how thick you're talking about at the end of it, but there's not a lot of room to change once you're
There's
committed.
not a lot, yeah, and I've tried that some. Sometimes you can get by with it. It depends on how much the bowl moves. But if I know that's the direction I want to go, I'm going to rough it in that shape, okay, roughly. So yeah, this one I'm just going to kind of do kind of a regular kind of bowl shape. And a bowl shape is kind of whatever is pleasing to your eyes. When you look at people talking about what's a good shape for a bowl, they talk about the classic shapes, and those are shapes that have been used through centuries because people know that's pleasing to the eye. You get bowls that are not so classic that are they're just not as pleasing. So I think there's an aesthetic part of it. Obviously, the artists can choose and do whatever they want to do. But I think there's pretty bowls and not so pretty bowls, and that's really, I try to shoot for something that's got a shape I think that is a little more aesthetic. But again, that's kind of in the eye of the beholder.
Did you buy that blank? What was the saran wrap for on the outside?
I did the saran wrap just because I cut these up a week ago. Is that what you're asking about, the saran
Yes.
wrap?
Does
I
it
don't.
help hold in moisture, I guess? or-
It was just, yeah, I was trying to reduce splitting.
Okay.
If I roughed them out a week ago, they would be really split on the end, have a lot of checking I'd have to get rid of. I could probably still salvage them. No, I don't normally do that. It's just I cut up 8 or 10 blanks for this, and I wanted to do something temporary. I usually will use anchor seal.
But you did that instead of painting or sealing or something?
I did that instead of anchor sealing. Yeah, it was just kind of a quick and dirty way to keep some moisture in. If you leave it on very long, it'll mold. It doesn't let any air out. And that's what the anchor seal does. It lets some drying occur. It just slows the drying process.
when you're roughing out a bowl, how smooth do you like to get it?
Pretty smooth. If there's a lot of tear out, I just don't like a lot of tear out. You can do it rough and dirty and have a lot of tear out. I'm maybe enough OCD that I like it fairly smooth. I don't do a real nice finish cut, but most of them are pretty smooth, not ready to sand.
Okay.
I think you might help me, somebody grab this, help me slide this out.
And Eric, will you cut a tenon in the bottom of that, or?
Yeah, I'm gonna do a tenon.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna do a tenon now for my chuck. If it's a big chuck, a big bowl, you wanna do a bigger chuck. And the rule of thumb I've heard, as far as the size of the tenon, you'll see variations of that. If you do a real small tenon, you just don't have enough strength. A great big tenon, then you're gonna either have a big bottom, or you've got a lot of work later when you do the final turning.
Are you gonna final turn this, or will it?
No, yeah, that's another one.
Yeah.
I'll do that sometime.
Well, okay, you're gonna do a tenon that sticks out.
Right.
How do you get rid of that in the end?
I can show you.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah.
Do you have to do a tenon that sticks out, or can you do a recess?
You can do a recess. I just
determine?
I just don't do recesses.
Okay,
So it's and
personal
I think it is. You know, and the problem is, since I start between centers, I've never really been able to visualize how to do a recess very well when I've got the tailstock up there. The tailstock's in the way. Unless I have I guess I could make a gizmo that kind of makes that tenon, because you can't really get in there because the tenon needs to be angled out a little bit. And I just couldn't really, in my mind, picture that. You hear people say with a recess, you can split it. So you need to be gentle then when you're putting your chuck in the recess and opening the chuck up to hold the bowl. You're going against the grain. I mean, you're going against the stability of the wood. You're trying to split it, is the argument against it. A lot of people use them. I think it's just it's really, in my mind, it's personal preference.
Well, the other thing with recess is the way the bowl sits then, it looks sort of clunky. Like that tenon, when you finish styling that thing, it adds to the beauty of the bowl.
Mhm.
So, like I'm with Eric, I don't ever do recesses on bowls.
Right.
I may do them on some other kind of thing I'm turning, but not on a bowl.
Right. And I just don't, because I never did them.
Well, it could warp, I guess. I mean, it's gonna warp some.
Either way, the tenon's going to warp too, though.
Right.
So when you do the final turning, when you have the wood that's dry, you're going to put it back on the lathe, do the final turning, you have to true up that tenon
Yeah.
to get it back
I've
in
used
the
the
chuck.
recess on some smaller bowls,
Okay.
but I've probably used them more on platters.
Right.
Not
I can
as
show you
heavy.
the recess right
Not
there
as
behind
heavy.
you. I got a bowl behind you, it's got a recess in it. Somebody wants to get it.
It'll definitely work.
Yeah, I think if you're this is just my gut, if you're using a faceplate, so if I have this basically screwed to the lathe, I can pull my tailstock away and I can make a recess.
Yeah.
The way I'm between centers, I can't do that. So to me, it just always made more sense to do that. But people do both. And you see some of the big guys do tenons too. I mean, the good
I
ones.
never understood, I had seen both, I never had understood the preference.
I think it's personal preference. I really do. But it just makes sense to me. You can crush the tenon some, but you're not going to crush it off unless the wood's not any good. But you can spread that recess too much and blow the wood.
The wood is actually stronger in the compression of the tenon than it is in the expansion of the recess.
So then I made these kind of rough jigs as far as my chucks. So this is just two of the chucks. So the bigger diameter is when the chuck is all the way open, And the smaller diameter is when it's all the way closed. So if I'm gonna use, and I would use this one, which is the kind of the standard 50 millimeter jaws. This one I think is big enough for this bowl. When you start getting a tenon this big on a bowl this size, you've got a pretty fat tenon. So this is one I would use on a bigger bowl. This is the one I would use on this size. Now if you're doing,
Those are just gauges for your cannons, is that right?
right, just a gauge, rough gauge on the diameter.
Not a local gauge.
Some people will, do other ways to mark their size, but you need to I need to know now what size am I gonna make that tenon.
Yeah.
So, and if you do it right, the tenon needs to be as small as it can be for your jaws. And the idea is if your jaws are all the way open, and then you squeeze down on the tenon, it's just touching the corner of each jaw, which there's 4 jaws. So you've got 8 points of where it's touching the wood. So it's going to crush those 8 points and not be quite as strong. I've rarely run into problem with that. When you're doing rough turning like this, when the bowl's wet and you know it's going to move, and then when it's dry, I've got to put it back on and turn that tenon back down a little more to true it up. If I have that tenon really small and I have to true it up, I could get it too small for my jaws, and I've done that before. So on the roughing out, I'll do it. I'm not going to do it as big as I can get it, but I'm going to do it somewhere in between these two, so I have room next time when I final turn it to turn that tenon down a little bit. I'll just eyeball it. Okay, so I've got kind of a rough shape. It's got this knot in it, which actually I'm gonna leave. This front face is irregular, so I'm gonna have to turn some of that off when I flip it around. So when I'm looking at the shape of my bowl, I've got to kind of visualize, what if I don't have this part of this rough part, do I still have a good shape? If you flip it around and you turn a whole bunch of that off, it changes your shape and it may not be the shape you want. So right now I've got this, I didn't go all the way to the edge, because where I've got this now could be the top of my bowl, so I can still picture the shape of my bowl roughly. That's about what I want, and this is rough turning, so it's not, you can adjust it when you do your final turning. So for the tenon, I want to have a flat base for the tenon jaws to sit on, and I want the diameter then of course needs to be what I need. So I'm close to that. There's different ways to do it. You can use a parting tool. Sometimes I can get by with a fingernail grind on the bowl gouge, so I'm going to try that and see if I can get close.
How deep do you make your tenon?
I'm probably going to go 1/4 inch, roughly. The depth, you're limited some by the chuck jaw, by how deep the chucks are.
Use all that
But I don't do it.
depth?
I don't do a 1/2 inch.
You don't want it to bottom out on your chuck.
Right, right. And that's one reason that I have to kind of flatten the bottom of the tenon out, because if there's a bunch of material in there, it's going to get stuck, hung up in the jaws. So that needs to be fairly flat as, but at least narrow enough. And I'll show that to you in a minute. But I do maybe 1/4 inch, 3/8, something like that.
Let me ask a question on that. If you were doing a really large bowl, would you make a deeper tenon?
maybe a little deeper, but bigger.
Yeah.
Bigger diameter. They don't have to be very deep, it's just really the diameter has a lot to do with it. And I'm borderline on this one as far as diameter, but I can get by with it, I think.
So, do you use, in that case of a bigger bowl, do you use a bigger chuck? Because you know, you're just saying you don't want to spread
Right.
your jaws.
You need a bigger chuck, you need a bigger
Okay.
jaws. It can be the
Okay.
same chuck, you need bigger jaws.
Oh,
You can't have too many chucks.
Our jaws for them like hammers.
I mean, you don't want to have to take those screws out all the time to put new jaws on there. You know, you just need new chucks. Yeah.
You know, that's the advantage of that Easy Wood chuck. I bought one and it is really nice.
Yeah.
Cause you can pop the other jaws on in seconds.
Yeah. Which is more viable now. There was a point when when Technitool had their, well, they were, what they call them? They were repaired or refurbished chucks for $100. The Supernova 2 for $100 a piece, included the 50 millimeter jaws, and they were, I don't know what's wrong with them, they worked fine for me, but they were refurbished, reconditioned. I haven't found those for a long time. Okay, so I have my tank. It's going to be too big. I'm just using a parting tool to kind of get it right.
yeah, I'm sorry, Eric, you use the parting tool for what? The shape?
Just to kind of fine tune the shape of the tenon. Okay, so I've got my rough shape. I've got a bottom there that I can make work. I'm thinking, you know, when I'm second turning it, when it's dry and I'm going back and turning it again, I'm thinking, you know, am I going to be able to make this work? So the bottom I'm going to be able to make work. The shape I can make work. So I don't want to make it and then not be usable or workable down the road. If I'm second turning it, if it's been dry and I'm going back now to finalize it, that's exactly what I would have done so far. I would have had a bowl already that's rough turn. This is dry. And what I would have done then differently is instead of driving my spur drive in there, which is going to mark it up, what I'm going to do is jam chuck it. Okay? So what I could do is I could just take a chuck. Since I'm going to turn it out anyway, I'm not really worried about marring that inside of the bowl too much, so I can put the chuck on. I can just push it up in there. I can bring my tailstock up. And what I've done, here's something we want to make sure we're doing. I don't want to get rid of that nib in the middle. Okay? I need that when I second turn it. That's going to help me center it later. All right? So whatever kind of chucking you use, or what kind of connecting to the lathe, whether it's the between centers like I do, you know, whether it's the face plate, you still want to make sure there's a nib or a divot there in the middle that you can find later. Okay? So, and this is why. If I'm going to take this dry bowl and I'm going to turn it again, I jam that up in there. I don't think I'm strong enough for a big lathe. All right, so that's my center. I've got my center now that I left on there when I rough turned it, and so now I can true up that tenon. Okay, now this one happens to be not moving because I just It was pretty dry when I rough turned it. But that's the only difference. What I just did, I would do again with a dry piece of wood now. So the first thing I would do would be true this tenon up, because it's going to be warped a little bit, and I'm going to true the outside of the bowl up because it's going to be warped.
How can you be sure that, because you've got it jammed, how can you be sure that front is true or centered?
Well, when it's really warped, you have to do the best you can. So what I would do if it's really warped is turn it and just look at my tenon and see, get as little wobble as I can, okay? Usually it works pretty well. It does, it usually warps relatively symmetrically. It might be an egg, but it's an egg that's symmetrical. So jam chucking like this usually is okay. I also have leftover pieces of wood that I've had chucked in there. I turn something off, and what I'll do with that leftover piece of wood that has a tenon in it, if it's dry wood, is I'll turn maybe turn it kind of concave, and I'll use that as a jam chuck for something else. So I have those different sizes, different lengths, so I could chuck that piece of wood and then put my bowl on there. So what I would do now is just true that tenon up to make it round, true the outside of the bowl so it's not so wobbly. But that's the only thing different I would have done if this were second time around. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to put this on the tenon, or in the chuck.
Will you be putting this on
YouTube?
the website or
It'll be-
Facebook?
Yes, the video for this, when I get it edited, will go on IKI Woodturners on YouTube. Just search for IKI Woodturners, no spaces, and you'll find this video.
Great, thanks.
I'm just hoping everything turns out okay with it, lighting wise.
Depending on your chuck jaws, some chuck jaws are fairly straight. In other words, your tenon needs to be fairly straight. Some chuck jaws are pretty angled where you've got to get a 15-degree angle or whatever to fit. So the angle of your tenon needs to fit whatever jaws you've got. All right, so that's turning pretty true. But since it's still kind of irregular, I want to pull my tailstock up for some little extra protection here initially. It's still got a good bit of mass. And then I'm just going to true up this side a little bit. Okay, so now I've got that I've got this trued up pretty well, so I'm spinning pretty true. Then I can take my tailstock away, hopefully without hitting anybody. And here's another thing that you're going to want to do. You ever heard of Turner's elbow? Does that come off or does it bang? Does it snap out?
You can just keep turning it back and it'll pop off.
It should drop off.
Does it pop off?
It'll push it out. Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, Turner's elbow is when you're turning and you do this. So you want to get rid of the point. so now I'm just gonna turn the inside out, turn the wood out. And what I've been doing so far is pull cuts, turning pull cuts this way. On the inside of the bowl, then you turn it the other way. Once I get this out, then I'm gonna start bring my handle way over here and start turning it this way. I'll show you that.
Is that the same tool you did the outside with?
Say it again?
Is that the same tool you did the outside with?
Same one, yeah, yeah. I started out with 1/2 inch and now I'm going to 3/8. I'm going to go to a depth. What I want to do is turn this about 10% of the diameter of the piece. So if this is 10 inches, I want to make it about 1 inch thick. And I usually kind of eyeball that. You can measure, but you know, this is I'd do 3/4 of an inch thick or 1 inch maybe. The thicker it is, just the longer it takes to dry. One of the keys is going to be to get the whole bowl fairly consistent thickness. If you do the outside too thin and the inside too thick, it's going to split. So that's going to be, you need to have fairly consistent thickness, including the bottom. So the challenge is, where's the bottom of the bowl? On the roughing amount, I'll usually rough gauge it because you can kind of get an idea. I've turned some funnels, so you can, if you go too thin, it's what you get. There's a lot of different ways to kind of measure or gauge the bottom. And one is something like this, which is something I made. And what it does, it goes on the ways. And when you do this beforehand, what I do is I put this here, and I put the end of the stick right at the tip of the face of the front face of the jaws. So I know that's how deep, as deep as the bottom of the bowl is, okay? And on my lathe, this is at spindle height. So it would be like this on this lathe. So then now what I would do then is I would mark this is where the front of those jaws are. I can put a mark like a piece of tape on the lathe, mark something on the lathe where you know, okay, that is where the bottom of this is. Now that's where this is when the little dowel is at the front face of these jaws. That's the depth bottom of my bowl. That's one way to do it. The other way is something like this, and I'll show you that when we get closer.
Yeah, that jig's not going to work on your new American Beauty, correct?
That one won't.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just throw that away.
Okay.
Yeah. I might sell it.
Ah.
So what I'm going to do, one of the things that's easy to do if you don't enter the wood right is you're going to skate. The tool's going to want to slide out, okay, and catch and pull out. I've got to remember that the bevel of the gouge is the direction that the tool's going to want to go in. So what I can look at is what's the bevel of my gouge, and and I want to line that up to the direction I'm going to go. I enter the wood then with my face closed, fairly closed, meaning this part of the gouge is facing the wood, okay? If I start out with the gouge, you don't ever want it straight up because it can be really, really aggressive on the bowl. Some call it skating the bevel, but that's where my tool is riding on this bevel. Whenever you see it bouncing is when I get off of the bevel. I lose the bevel, and the wood, the gouge is gonna bounce around. So I got my handle way over. And then when I'm running the bevel, so my left hand is just supporting the tool. I'm not pushing it with my left hand. I'm pushing in toward the wood with my right hand. Okay, so I'm following that bevel. When I want it to turn, I bring the handle in. I don't push it with my left hand. Then when I get away from the tailstock, I get that chatter that bounces a little bit. I want to make sure I'm going fairly consistent with the thickness of the wood.
Jerry, do you typically use a scraper when you're rough turning? Because you said you like to get it pretty smooth.
I don't scrape. I don't ever use a scraper.
Not even a negative rake scraper? Is that right?
I just made one like 2 weeks ago, so I've been playing with that a little. I just never used a scraper. You could, but I wouldn't. I don't care about that much of a good finish on the rough bowls. I mean, really, you're roughing out, you're getting a lot of bowls out, so you don't have to take a lot of time with them. If there's a lot of tear out, I'll try to make a little better cut, but not that level of
Okay.
finish.
What'd you make one out of, may I ask?
Say it again.
What'd you make one out of, may I ask?
I had an old scraper that I just put a negative rake on it. I've had it for years and years and never used it.
I turn very little green wood. Does the tool stay a lot sharper turning green wood?
You gotta turn green wood. It's so much fun. It turns so much easier than dry.
Yeah.
So much easier. But yeah, it definitely keeps the tools, they just cut easier, they stay sharper than the dry wood. And you can turn this to a finished shape. You just know that you're gonna get some movement. So you could turn this to whatever thickness you want. And if it's not super wet and spitting water, which real fresh water would just spit water all over you, or fresh wood will spit water, you could sand it to 220. And then I usually will let it dry a little bit, put it in a bag, let it dry for a few weeks, and then final sand it. But you could do that and just know that the wood's going to move a little, and you have a bowl that's not perfectly round.
Is there some advantage to turning it, rough turning it when it's fresh for?
It's a lot easier to turn it. But if you want a bowl that's perfectly round, either you're going to have to start out with a really dry chunk of wood, or you need to turn it second time around when it's dry.
Have you ever tried to dry one in a microwave?
I have.
How'd that work out?
It works. I usually don't, this is what if I go to the shop and think, I just want to turn, I'll put a chunk of wood and just turn a bunch of bowl blanks. And that's why I have a whole bunch of bowl blanks that are drying at home, because I don't really like second turning them. So they just sit there for years. So I'm not in a hurry, so if I decide I want to finish a bowl or buy it, make a gift or something, I'll just dig in the pile and get an old dry piece of wood. And, so I'm usually not thinking I'm going to make this into a final product and want to dry it quickly. But the microwave thing works.
What's your moisture content roughly when you make your final bowl?
Around here, maybe 10%, 8%. I've gotten it, I've got a little kiln, or it's an old refrigerator that I've got a light in. It's all stripped out. And I've gotten it down to 5%, but I don't think it stays there.
Yeah, it probably sets back in.
Yeah. Okay, so this is, I can rough the depth of the bowl with this. I've seen these made with 2 sticks and 1 stick. And what you can do is you stick this stick down in the middle of the bowl, bring this up to the rim, and then you just hold it there. So that's my depth of my bowl. And then I bring this back over to the rim again, and I can eyeball down and see how thick I am, and I'm still pretty thick. The 2 sticks, and you've got 2 sticks you can eyeball down, which is probably more accurate, but to me this is a good gauge. So I'm still 1.5 inches thick at the bottom, so I need to get more out of the bottom. But that's kind of an easy, rough, homemade gauge.
Sell those jigs too?
Pretty close. I can go a little bit more. Okay, and then the last thing I'm going to do, I've got sharp edges, and if I'm going to let this dry, I want to get rid of these sharp edges. I've got a sharp edge on the inside and outside, and I'm just going to take the edge off of the inside and outside of the rim. So that would be roughed out, pretty consistent thickness. It's, roughly 10% of the diameter of the bowl. So what I would do then is mark it, date it on the bottom. I usually mark what kind of wood it is, and then I would put anchor seal on it, and that'll just allow it to dry slowly and stick it in a pile somewhere.
Put anchor seal all over it, or?
I do anchor seal all over it. Really, you don't need to you can just do the end grain. But if you look at kind of trying to paint the end grain, you've got, 10% of the bowl you ended up not covering, So I just usually cover the whole thing. Some people will put saran wrap around just the edge here, or they've got the edge covered so that doesn't split. The idea is you want it to dry consistently, and the end grain is going to dry quicker. So that's where you're going to get your splits. So I just seal the whole thing.
Eric, from this stage, how would you finish the bottom?
Okay. So if this were, this is my final turn, right? I've sanded the inside, sanded the outside. Now I'm going to finish the bottom. Again, you could do a jam chuck. You just want to cushion it. So you could get a piece of wood in there that's kind of rounded to fit the bottom of this. Put some like a hobby craft foam, neoprene, a couple paper towels, something just to keep it from marring up the inside of it. But then you would jam chuck it up. I've got a vacuum chuck, which makes it so I can get to the bottom easier. So I would have something there to jam it. And again, if you've got a vacuum chuck, it's just really handy if you're going to do a lot of bowls. And you can do kind of these homemade. Mine's homemade, and you just have to get the vacuum. The rest of it's really easy. But I would jam chuck that like that, or vacuum it, one of the two. Even if I'm vacuuming it, I'm going to jam it like this at first. Whoa. Hit speed. Okay. So what I would do is kind of figure out how big of a bottom do I want, how big of a flat do I want, but I would just turn the tenon off like that. Okay. So then I want to have a little bit, make it a little concave, and then I turn it down to a nib, small as I can that I'm comfortable with. Or again, if you're back chucking, you can take the tailstock away and completely access the bottom, which is kind of the beauty of it. And then if I leave a nib like that, which I would with the tailstock up, and then I just chisel that away with a little hand chisel, sand it, and never know it was there. Some people will leave part of the tenon as part of the base. I just like them kind of smooth and flat like this. But I'll go ahead and finish that. I'll make it a little bit concave and just leave a nib.
Do you ever use cold jaws to hold it?
I do. I prefer the vacuum, but the cold jaws are fine. Whoever asked that, I didn't see who asked that. But yeah, you could do cold jaws. You could do. I would have brought it. There are a couple different options as far as gripping the outside of the bowl like you would with cold jaws. So those are an option, or the vacuum, or even between centers, because you're just going to leave a nib and you could chisel that away really easily. What I could do, you could get a straight edge of some kind of ruler, make sure that you are a little bit concave, which it is. And then what I would do then is just take a little chisel that away, and then I've got little bitty 1-inch sanding discs that I could put into Jacob's chuck, and then you can really easily sand any kind of nib away if you've got anything left, which makes it really kind of a nice bottom. The other thing I like to do in a bottom is not leave it smooth like this. I'll do some kind of a decorative mark just so when people turn it over, which all wood turners are going to turn your bowl over, at least they know you paid attention to it and done something. See, and you can do that even with a chuck or a gouge.
The spiraling tool works good for that too.
Spiraling tool, yeah, spiraling tool, a parting gouge or a parting gauge, you could do that. Anything that's going to give it a little bit of a decoration.
The vacuum chuck spoils you.
Yeah, yeah. Then I can just do and get to it.
Spoils you.
The spiral tool, put it in it.
So something that simple just adds a little bit of something to the bottom. Any other questions?
Eric, what grind do you prefer on your gouge?
The one I end up with. You know, you can come look at mine. I'm not sure that, I don't measure them. I kind of set it up the way I like it on my, I've got the what's it called, the Wolverine setup, kind of a homemade setup. So I have two grinds I use. One is a fingernail grind and one's more the bowl gouge grind. The angles, I don't know. I'm not sure what they are. But it's kind of, that's what I've gotten used to. And I tried fairly recently playing with that, and when I adjusted put my gouge in that Wolverine setup, instead of, I used 2-inch depth, instead of 2 inches, I went with an inch or 1.5 inches or 1.75 inches. And I just didn't like it. You know, I just didn't get it the way I wanted it, so I went back to that 2-inch depth. And I have two settings that I use, and that's what I use. I don't think they're far off from what they're saying, like 40 degree and 60 degree or something. All right, great.
Thank you.